Today's guest on the Winning Teams podcast is Sally Loftis, who is the founder and chief executive of Loftis Partners based in North Carolina. Now, Sally's background is really interesting. She's a HR background. She does a lot of work in the consulting area. She does a lot of work in strategy, but she also specializes in pay justice. And we spend quite a bit of time talking about, what do we mean by pay justice, pay equity? What does it mean? What are the traps that organizations can fall into? And how can the work that Sally and her business Loftis Partners do can really help organizations to manage their way through that, which is a bit of a minefield in many cases. We also talk about DE&I, the progress that has been made, and have we made progress? And also talk about the world of hybrid, how we're managing it, how people are going to land on that, and how organizations will manage their way through that. Again, it's not a one size fits all, but it's a challenge for organizations. And Sally has got an interesting take on that. So really encourage you to listen to Sally, real expert in her space, and certainly gave me an insight on what she talks about pay equity and pay justice. So we really would appreciate if you're listening to this, if you can go and give us a review wherever you're listening to the podcast, because that helps us to get to more people, which is the whole object of the exercise. But in the meantime, sit back and enjoy listening to the very interesting Sally Loftis. Sally, thank you so much indeed for joining us here in the Winning Teams podcast, hailing all the way from the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina. You're very welcome here.
Thank you, John. I'm excited to be here and join you today.
Well, looking forward to this conversation. The business that you set up, Loftis Partners, which is 100% woman-owned consulting firm, as I said, based in North Carolina. But your specialization is in people, kind of strategy, but also pay justice. And I was just curious as why pay justice. I mean, I'm not saying you shouldn't do pay justice, but I'm just curious why that is a specific area for the business and what led you to actually include that.
That's a great question, and probably pay justice is not a term a lot of people have heard of.
Oh.
So a couple of things, what led me into it is my career has been in human resources. So I've always worked more on the cash and non-cash incentive and compensation structures. So, and on the strategy side. So that's kind of my experience. In my previous kind of last internal role at a organization, we were going through some a pay restructure and just kept hearing from employees over and over again about, like, everybody says it's cheaper to live here. I'm in a mountainous area, but it's really not. It feels more expensive. So that kind of really sent me on this path of, what's myth and what's real around pay for our people and how much it did cost to live in this place that we were asking people to relocate to. And then another piece, so that kind of started, and then I went into a graduate school program around organizational development and actually did my thesis on pay equity, and decided just to kind of explore that and really dig into it, because when you hear about pay equity, you might hear about pay parity, and then pay justice is another piece. So pay equity is basically you're paying the same for roles across your organization. Pay parity is really paying among kind of intersectional identities the same levels of pay. Pay justice is really a term I use to just talk about kind of the systemic work required to change how we pay people in a meaningful way.
Yeah. So when you talk about pay equity, I mean, what are the most common issues that you're looking to resolve? What are the issues that you go into organizations to kind of iron out? Because it sounds as if this could be quite a complicated and complex issue, and perhaps not one that's really readily understood. And I can imagine it's a bit of a minefield for companies as well. So what tend to be the issues that you go in to help them resolve?
You really summarized that well. Absolutely complicated and complex. And a lot of times people don't have, the human resources capability, right, to go in and do this work, because what I find is that pay equity tends to be a thread that once you start pulling it, it undoes your sweater of employee engagement. And so a couple of things, I'll give you examples of what people come to me with. One is, here in the United States, we have a lot of states, cities, territories coming online with pay transparency laws. So they may say, okay, we want to do a little bit more than be legally compliant in those, which typically is, depending on your size of organization, you're required to post a salary range in any job openings based on where you are. So that's one thing. And we talk about, okay, what happens whenever you post a salary range for a job and you haven't communicated that information to everybody in the organization, or at least everybody that may be in that pay range, and they're finding out, oh, wait, so-and-so is getting paid more, or I'm in that range and I didn't know the range was that. So it creates a lot of conversations that you want to be on the forefront of, because then if you don't, you're kind of creating this sense of distrust with your employees. So I work with people kind of, getting ahead of that. The other piece is, we had pay equity, wage stagnation issues before the pandemic. What happened with COVID-19 and so many other things, it just amplified what was already happening. The United States has had wage stagnation for the last 40 years. And a lot of employers all of a sudden realized that they hadn't been keeping up with cost of living and those increases every year, and were finding themselves way behind on what other people were paying. So I'll go in and basically kind of help organizations restructure their compensation at a more systemic level, because a lot of times people will do it more at the entry level and then maybe at the higher level, and which then creates salary compression at the middle level.
Right. So was the issue when they compared themselves to other companies within the US, or was it when they compared themselves to global positions or global companies?
It would depend. It would absolutely depend. So one thing is like thinking about a US based company, right? You're probably comparing yourself to, if everybody in your organization works in the US, you're probably comparing yourself to US, right? Then also people across the United States, and when we have 330 million people here, depending on where you live in the United States, you're having a different wage and cost of living experience. So for instance, Seattle, Washington, right now, kind of the average cost of living is about $95,000. Raleigh, North Carolina, it's about $63,000. So, it's really looking at the geographic differences. And then with the pandemic, all of a sudden you have remote people, right? So then you're trying to figure out, how do we pay people when they're maybe not based in the same city as us, and or maybe not even in the same country? And that creates a whole nother, kind of level of complexity within your compensation structure.
Because also, if my understanding is correct, within the states, there are within the different states, there's different legislation and different taxation. So your net take home can be quite different, even if your gross is the same. So, and if you're looking at that, and you're looking at then from an international and remote working, how do you square? I mean, is this a kind of a circle you're trying to square, or how do you actually get it to be equitable?
I wish I could tell you do this one thing and it changes everything, but that one answer is not out there. It really depends on the makeup of your company, number one. So, I've worked with global groups who, for instance, have, maybe half their people in the United States, 20% in Europe and 30% in Africa. Those continents alone have had very different experiences, right? Around cost of living. Honestly, you get into Europe, the increases in cost of living mostly have been higher, and then Africa have been, made 40% increases, So again, we kind of look and say, okay, what's the structure? What are we going for? A lot of times we step back and say, okay, what's the pay philosophy? Sometimes people will say, okay, it's just a pay, we want to be the world's best employer. And, that means we get the best people. Well, that's a great intention, but how do you do that? Is then saying, okay, that means, are we paying at 75% of the market rate? then if you're doing 75% of the market rate, who are you comparing yourself to? Are you comparing yourself to organizations that are like you and who are maybe who you want to be like, or maybe your people are going to, so it really kind of gets into what kind of talent we want to have at our organization, where do we want to compete for talent, and how do we do that in an intentional way so that it's not blowing our budget,
Mm.
or creating instability in our long-term financials.
Sounds like a very challenging issue that to try and resolve. Can I ask you about pay transparency? You mentioned it
Mhm.
there. Just to explain to everyone exactly what you mean by pay transparency and why is it such a big deal right now?
That's a great question. And, you being based in Europe, sometimes, you probably know, like, for instance, I work a lot with companies in England. So there's already a lot of pay transparency reporting
Yeah.
required, by gender, race, and ethnicity. So it's really a newer concept in the United States. Part of it is really helping people understand what they're getting into in jobs. Really, there's a lot of inefficiency created within the hiring process. Think about whenever you're hiring, for an executive level role, if you don't share the pay until the end, and it doesn't match, like, you've
Mm.
just wasted so much time. So there's a level of efficiency there. There's also a level of accountability that organizations have to have, that they're paying living wages. So
Mm.
for instance, this month, New York City, their new minimum wage is about to be $19 an hour, which, I live in North Carolina. Ours is $7.25. So that's a pretty big
Wow.
difference, right? Um, so, it's really another way kind of for organizations to be seen as accountable to paying living wages. And so people know ahead of time. And, you know, I don't know how much, obviously the government kind of monitors that stuff about whether you're posting and, the complexities around that. But it's really, again, promoting accountability into the process. And it's also a trust building action for me. Like, I wouldn't need a law require me to do that, because it then shows the candidates that, hey, we're willing to share this with you up front, and rather than we're trying to hide this behind a screen until you get to a certain point.
Right.
That was a lot of information.
Sure. But just come back to pay equity.
Mhm,
One thing that you haven't mentioned, at least not
mhm,
leaned into too much, was the difference in when you talk about pay equity, the fact that in many situations men are getting paid more than women for doing the same
mhm.
role. Is that a big issue that you deal with?
Absolutely. A lot of times, what I will do with clients is I lead out with typically a pay equity assessment, which is just basically a framework of going and reviewing all of their pay data based on different demographic markers. So that
Mm.
might be, gender, race, ethnicity, age. We look at, tenure. We look at just different pieces there to kind of see what's going on. And then we also lay it together over intersectional identity. So thinking
Mm.
about, a Black woman, over 40, or, things like that, and start just kind of really digging in and seeing who's in the organization and how that lines up to potentially who's leaving the organization most
Yeah.
frequently.
Okay. So if I can shift gear, because I know that
Mhm,
you also do quite a lot of work on DE&I,
mhm,
and I'm just curious about the DE&I and the work that has been done over the last couple of years. And I'm just wondering, do you believe that we are really making progress? Do you feel that companies, are, keeping the focus on that and moving it ahead, or have they moved on to other things that are hitting the radar?
That is such a great question, John. And there are a lot of ways I can answer it. I will say, I think it depends on the company. I do think there's a greater awareness, at least in my experience in the United States and in the areas I work in. I do think there's a greater awareness around diversity, equity, inclusion. What I have found is that a lot of organizations kind of fall down when it gets to conversations and bridge building to a new future.
Mm.
So I will see, clients maybe come in and say, we did all this work in 2021, and like we're still not making progress. So they haven't done some of the systemic work around, how do you create a culture of inclusion? How do you change your practices in ways that's going to build equity? So, yeah, I mean, I think it's based on where you live, based on your organization, whether we've moved past awareness and into action.
Yeah. I mean, my sense is that, we, particularly in light of the whole kind of George Floyd and what happened
Mm-hmm.
immediately afterwards, obviously, it became a huge issue, not just in the US, but globally.
Mm-hmm.
And my sense was that, CEOs were taking hands-on responsibility
Mm-hmm.
for doing something. And I'm just wondering, and that's fine because that brings it front and center of an organization. Whereas, very often kind of say, well, the HR department can look after that.
Mm-hmm.
And then it becomes something over here. It's not quite here, it's over here. And I'm just wondering if there really is the same focus being put on it as there has been, or have we just kind of moved on and kind of become a little bit kind of, well, we're doing something about that. I'm not quite sure what it is, but we're doing something about that.
I think it's changing, and I will even say day by day. For instance, right before I got on this call with you, I was just reading how in North Carolina, we've now passed these 13 topics you cannot train state employees on. A lot of them are very based on race and gender. So that's a political move that, although, it's state employees, that's still a huge employer in our state.
Sure.
And there are a lot of state laws and of course federal, but state heavy laws right now that impact how employers show up, what they can offer to employees, things like that. So I do think like the next few years are going to be super challenging, depending on who wins the presidency, and who kind of are leading the states in different ways. What will happen and how organizations show up, because there may be even more limits put, like legal limits put on organizations. Just the affirmative action just got overturned in the United States, right?
Yeah.
And that could really have an impact on corporate DE&I groups.
Yeah. Well, you talked there about a few minutes ago about the whole kind of the shift to remote working,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm just curious from your perspective working with organizations, because my sense is that so many organizations are struggling to try and kind of get that, what's right, what does hybrid look like,
Mm-hmm.
what's fit for purpose, are we do we actually need people in the office, do we not need people in the office, and I think there's a big argument about that. I'm just wondering from your perspective, where do you see it going? Where do you think we will land? I mean, I don't think there's going to be a one, kind of one size fits all for everybody, but how do we also keep the remote workers engaged
Mm-hmm.
in the culture and the whole kind of belief and values of an organization? Sorry, that's a very big question in one.
It is. I'm going to say
Yeah,
it all in one sentence. Just
yeah.
kidding. Yeah, I mean, again, I think I go back a lot to, it's going to require intention and more conversations.
Mm,
In the past, we could kind of say we're going to do it and people followed, and we had data driven, decision making. I think what's changing is that people are not as willing to follow. Employee engagement, or lack of, is at an all-time high, right? I mean, it's like 77% right now in the United States based on Gallup research. So you have to kind of say, okay, what's our intention for doing this, and have conversations alongside your employees and discuss it, listen to feedback, talk about what it looks like, and really kind of, I always suggest that teams have team agreements for, if you're working in a hybrid or fully remote workplace, have some agreements together that you come to, like, these are the times you're expected to kind of be responsive to email within, the next few hours, or, have, these are how, this is how long you have to review documents, things like that, so that everybody's getting the same information. And you've really got to be creative on how to keep people engaged, right? If you're having a meeting, doing that hybrid and keeping the virtual group engaged while there's people in person almost requires two facilitators at time.
yeah.
I've done several retreats like that, because you can't just treat the people on the screen as like secondary, but then you have people in person too. So it's a lot more intentional conversations, creative practices.
Yeah, and I think that for many of the leaders who have perhaps grown up in a very kind of command and control environment, that many of us would have experienced in our career, this is a big shift for the managers to work through that. One of the things that you talk about, in on your site is about trust, right?
Mhm.
And trust is also kind of very much that shift from command and control, because command and control is not about trust. How do we make that shift from command and control where we're really engaging and trusting?
Oh, that's a big question too. I will, one thing is I think having an awareness that we're living in a society that trust continues to erode in institutions and organizations. That's a
Mm,
long storied history. I encourage you, for listeners to explore that. So people are not showing up with a sense of trust in institutions anymore. So you're already kind of working from somewhat of a deficit, like you've got to earn a lot more trust. So then it's really focusing on what are the trust building actions we can take. So thinking about a team leader, it could be access to information. It could be, how do you have feedback loops in your organization, and really talking to your employees and listening to what does trust mean for them,
mm,
which is a little bit different than kind of the command and control you're talking about, right? Which is basically, I say it, you do it, no questions asked.
mm,
And it takes more time, which can be really frustrating. I'm an action-centered oriented person, like I am just like speed, speed, speed. So I've had to really intentionally build a lot more pause and reflection into my own practice to kind of step out of that command and control space.
mm. So what's next for Loftus Partners? Where is it? Where is the business going? Where is it evolving? What's the direction that you're taking it in?
Wow. I love all of your questions, Sean. Thank you. I also love the opportunity to vision. I will say what's next is really trying to work with more organizations around pay equity as we are doing this work in helping organizations. We're learning a lot of lessons and are able to share those and help people plug into the work. So I've been working with Pay Equity Collective for the last year, where it was groups of global healthcare nonprofits who are all interested in pay equity, and we came together with a community of practice. So I would like to build on that and create more communities of practice in the space, because what I'm finding is that pay equity, there's not one website you can go to get the right salary benchmarks for your for your roles. It's really about building community amongst fellow employers who may employ some of the same people or have some of the same goals, and being able to share that information together. So building a network is really powerful. So I'm hoping to kind of build more of those collectives and networks in the coming year, and really build on that message of pay equity and that it's possible to do without, breaking the bank.
Yeah, absolutely. And fascinating. Before we wrap up, you can tell people where they can get in
Mhm.
touch with you. Two questions that I ask everybody. One, a book that has had an impact upon you. What's the book and what was the impact?
It is hard to choose one book, and I'm going to go old school here, and I'm going to say Humble Inquiry by Edgar Schein, who actually just passed away in the last year. And that book, what I love about it is it sets up the different ways we can show up when we're leaders. One is, kind of an expert, one is an extra set of hands, and then one is as a process consultant. And that completely changed the way I showed up in HR, because I was always the expert. But the process consultant approach helps build capacity in other people to solve their problems. So completely transformed the way I did my work.
Oh, it's not a book I've come across. So I always love when
Ugh.
I come across something new. That is great. Daily rituals, Sally, do you have them? What are they and how do they serve you?
I will say daily rituals. It was funny when I was thinking about this question. It depends on the day. And I will say I am a night owl. So the morning is not my favorite time, but my ideal morning includes not having to be at a 9 o'clock meeting. It's usually later in the morning, but I do try to spend about 5 to 10 minutes in meditation. Sometimes it's guided, sometimes it's in silence, just trying to kind of get my mind centered. I also do kind of a daily practice of reading based on authors that I'm interested in. I usually kind of dedicate a whole year. So this year, I'm only reading work by Audre Lorde and just really kind of contemplating, think about what I'm hearing. I actually use like a Lectio Divina practice with that and do that. And then usually have a little eucalyptus oil in the air to wake me up and I'm ready to go.
I love the sound of that. Sally, where can people reach you? How can they get in touch with you? We'll put everything in the show notes, but if they're listening right now, how can they get in touch with you?
The best place to find me is LinkedIn. I'm on there many days a week, all the time. I have my personal page and then also the Loftis Partners page. I also have a monthly newsletter on LinkedIn called Fully Human Resources, which is really about just kind of people positive approaches, getting away from that command and control sense of leadership, but really that's a great place. I publish that the first Friday of the month. And then of course there's my website and we have a blog, and I'm happy to send you the blog post about how to do your own pay equity assessment, which is a really good first step for people to start looking at their information.
Okay, that'd be great, and we'll include that in with the show notes. Sally, thank you for joining us. It's been a real pleasure. I wish you every success. I think the work you're doing is fascinating and badly needed. But thank you for joining us today in the Winning Teams.
Thank you, John.